Hi, Officer Kooy with Arbor Shield. Welcome to the show. In the studio today, we have Detective Jack Foster. We have Community Standards Officer Jodi Dyer. And last but not least, Traffic Officer Stephen Dyer. Thank you for joining me in the studio today. Strangely enough, given their field of expertise, we'll be talking about traffic-related questions and answers, anything to do with investigation or detective work, and we'll touch on the polygraph as well in that. Parking enforcement and body cams. But before we do that, I thought we would start the show with just a brief video and talk about it in the studio and get your reactions as well, hopefully through email. So let's cut to that video now.
How's it going tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good. Hey, the reason why I pulled you over, that was a turn-only lane that you drove through that red light.
Actually, that was the straight lane.
The turn-only lane.
Okay.
Okay, I was right behind you. I know which lane you were in. Okay. How much have you had to drink tonight?
Plenty.
Plenty?
Yeah.
How much? Hold on! Shit! Six 5163. Shots fired. Shots fired. I repeat, that suspect just crashed into a telephone pole.
Okay, that entire episode caught on tape was right around 1 minute. And I guess what I want the audience to think about is when this officer effected this traffic stop, as you might have heard, it was for a very simple lane violation. As he makes contact with the driver, he notes the odor of alcohol. You'll also know the driver has the radio turned up, which is usually indicative of a drunk driver. In that amount of time, he's talking to the driver. What had happened was the driver of the vehicle came up with a revolver. The first shot fell out on a round that did not go off for whatever reason. The second round did go off, and that's when the officer returned fire. I'm going to throw some words up on the screen, and when you see those, I want you to imagine that you go through that as an officer. You wake up the next morning, and these are the words that are splashed all over the headlines and on the newspaper. I guess my biggest point in bringing this all home to the audience is please think for yourself and don't be spoon-fed by the media in creating all this frenzy and hype. If you were to see this in a newspaper, on the TV media, I guarantee you they're going to pump up things like the age, the race of the person. They're going to pump up over 10 rounds, put into the vehicle. All this stuff that does nothing but inflame the situation, does not cover the facts in their totality. And that's, I think, as officers, we'll discuss it for 2 seconds here, and I'd like to hear what my colleagues have to say about it. But it isn't the truth that offends officers. The truth is the truth. Nobody wants a bad cop out there. Nobody. But at the same time, don't take parts of truth, distort and manipulate them to sell newspapers or airtime. And I think that's what I take out of that. Anyhow, you guys have any comments about what we just saw, and I guess the media? I mean, you guys have both been doing this for a long time too. Any comments?
I guess I was thinking it's something that unfortunately happens more than you'd like to think. It's rather common for officers to be, injured or killed on traffic stops. Right. Whether it's in a situation like this where it's a shootout, or even more commonly where it's a traffic crash, actually, because someone, for whatever reason was not paying attention, drifted off the side of the road. But in that particular case, I think that the officer handled himself, really extremely well.
I agree with you. And you're a traffic officer, so you make how many stops typically in a day?
On an average day, on a normal day, quote unquote, probably around 10 traffic stops at least.
So an average of 10 stops a day. How many of those stops before you walk up to that car Do you know where that person came from, the history of the person? Do they have warrants? Do they have a gun in the car? Is there anything in the car that's going to hurt you? How much of that you know before you even get out of the driver's seat of your patrol car?
You don't really know any of that. We have the information where we can run the plate, and it will run the registered owner of the vehicle, and it'll say if they have a warrant or they give their driving status, but you don't know who the registered owner is. You know, it may not necessarily be the registered owner that's driving the vehicle, but for the most part, you don't know any of that information, and that's why they can be such dangerous situations, because you're going into it blind. You don't know if that person that's on the traffic stop is just, you know, a mother going to drop their child off at school and they had a bad day getting their kid off to school, or if it was somebody that, you know, 5 minutes prior to that traffic stop, you know, they may have shot someone.
Right.
Or if you look at the Tim McVeigh situation, that's how he was arrested, just off of a traffic stop. You know, and that led to his arrest.
Right. And I'll cut to you, Detective Foster. If memory serves me correct, we had a murder in the city, I don't know how many years ago it was, but eventually this person was apprehended, I think it was Utah, on a simple traffic stop, and they relate it back to that situation. So again,
Right.
just a situation where a simple traffic stop for an expired plate or whatever it was evolved into, you know, something much more.
And when I was looking at that video, and you can see the officer there now is getting fired upon by that person from an investigative standpoint, I'm looking at now how the law applies. Now you have a fleeing felon who's now has demonstrated use of force or deadly force on the officer. Now the officer now has to think in his mind, if I let this person go, what's the probability of this person hurting someone else?
Yes, exactly.
Given the fact that they were shot at, probably going to be great. Now he has to make a decision. His decision was to turn fire to stop this person from hurting someone else. So from looking at the video, it was a good call from the officer.
No, exactly. I don't know if I should apologize for getting so emotional, because it's what we do out here. But I take it very personally as an officer when I see the facts, as I've already stated, when I see the facts distorted, or 10% of the facts are relayed to an audience without regard for the other 90%, just to like I said before, to sell something, that's insane to me. So that's my 2 cents on that. We are now going to speak with Community Officer Jodi Dyer in regard to parking. And to do that, we went on the street, and we did some interviews with folks, and so some typical questions that they might have with regard to parking. So why don't we cut to our first interview, if you will, on the street.
Do you believe parking enforcement is necessary, and why?
I believe it is, because you don't want someone taking up a spot all day long.
What do you think is the #1 reason for a parking ticket?
The #1 reason for a parking ticket is to make money.
But as far as how much is being charged for a parking violation, I don't know. Some of the experiences I've heard of, that it was a little outlandish to be charged that much.
Over there at the parking structure, everybody pays for more time than they actually use. Everybody. And I think statistically it averages out for, you go in there for an hour, you pay for an hour and a half statistically, because it's set up so that if you go a minute or 10 minutes over the hour, you pay for the next hour. And that fits into the category of a scam.
What is most unfair about parking tickets, and why?
Well, I think what's most unfair about parking tickets is that you don't get a chance to explain what was going on. You know, there's situations, sometimes you might be late for court, you might be late for work. There's a bunch of situations, and I think that they should give you a chance maybe to explain within reasonable time and get a chance to get it knocked off.
Okay. Pretty good information and comments, I guess. All right, Jodi, you're on the hot seat. First off, you know, I've often seen, you know, the officers working in the city with regard to parking enforcement, and there are times when I think to myself, you know, we have kind of a thankless job, but I have my hats off to you guys, because really you are in a situation where most of the time you're going to bring enforcement action and or tow somebody's car, and so I appreciate the job that you do, and I know that it needs to be done. One of the comments was the reason that parking enforcement even occurs is to make money for the city, whether it be at Republic Parking or meters. And of course, there is an element of truth to that, but can you comment a little bit on your opinion? How many years have you been doing this now?
Almost 11.
Okay, 11 years. In your opinion, what is really the primary reason for you to be out there, especially in Ann Arbor with regard to enforcing parking? And hypothetically, let's suppose we didn't have parking enforcement tomorrow in the city. What do you think would happen? Go ahead.
I mean, our primary enforcement is to keep everybody, a lot of turnover at the meters, to keep chaos out, because otherwise people would be double parking. They would be in tow-away zones where you couldn't round corners. They would be blocking hydrants. They block driveways, so you wouldn't be able to get out of your driveway. And I mean, we're just here to enforce the law.
Yeah. And like you said, unfortunately, I guess we all wish we lived in a utopia where everybody living respected everyone else's rights. But you can wish for that, but that doesn't make it reality. So one of the gentlemen in the film there stated something along the lines of, "I wish parking enforcement would give us a chance." I'm not sure where he was going with that. I'm assuming maybe they go into the building for 5-10 minutes, or what I see a lot, and I'm sure you do too, is for some reason people think they put their hazards on. It's kind of a carte blanche to, I don't know, it's a wild card or something that allows them to do whatever. Can you comment a little bit with regard to the time factor? In other words, you come up onto a meter and somebody's running down the street, or you come across a vehicle that's parked with its hazards in a no parking zone. What's your usually your method of?
Well, all meters in the city have a 10-minute grace period. So if you are running a couple minutes late, you're covered. As far as running late, I mean, we don't know where you are. We don't know where you're coming from. We don't know where you went. So when I put the ticket on the car, there's nothing I can do as far as if you're running late or not. I don't know that. Right. Some people don't pay the meter because it's cheaper to stay in the meter spot than to pay the meter all day. So we don't know what your circumstances are when we're giving you a ticket. Okay.
So I'm starting to see a little overlap, if you will, between parking enforcement and law enforcement. That is to say, we would all love to be clairvoyant, you know what I mean, omniscient, and know everything about every situation, but it's just not reality. Whether I'm walking up to a car or whether I'm putting a citation on a vehicle, in your mind you've parked there for 4 minutes. This officer, you could have been parked there for an hour for all she knows. So she has to go by, totality of the situation, evidence, or whatever you want to call it, common sense. Let me ask you this. There seems to be some confusion with regard to Republic Parking, the structures, the maintenance of the meters, and I myself didn't know until we were talking earlier about that. So can you clarify for the audience there, what role does Republic Parking play with regard to the structures, the maintenance?
They're a business that they run the structures, but the city owns them. They maintain the meters, and they collect the money out of the meters, and the city gets a percentage, and it's all part of the parking agreement. So they are not just making all the money in the city, and the city's not getting anything. The city is getting something out of it, but they did a better job with regards to the structures than when the city had control of them.
Well, that makes sense. We were talking earlier, and you indicated that, I don't know, for the last year or 2 years, that the amount of hassle or near assaults that you've experienced in the job in your 11 years has started to escalate. And we won't get into why you think that is or why I think that is, but it is what it is. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe a near miss you've had or some sort of assault?
I think the most times we're at risk is when we're doing tows for outstanding parking tickets. Nobody wants to get towed. Sometimes people have a credit card and they can pay, and sometimes they can't. And when they can't, and you're taking their car, their means to get to work, to home, it can get a little sketchy. And we understand people are upset when their car gets towed. However, the law is the law, and we have to tow the car. There's a court order out for the vehicle, which is kind of like a warrant for your car, and we can't break that.
Okay.
So it does get a little, like I said, sketchy, but I mean, it's better to let your car get towed and pay the fines than to assault an officer, assault a tow truck driver, because then you're looking at assault charges and court dates and whatnot.
Yeah, like you indicated, I mean, it does, I could see, you know, I'm putting myself in the driver's situation. They're coming back, you're towing up their car, and like you said, they're late for an appointment or what have you, that, you know, your emotions go through the roof, but you make a good observation that, man, you don't want to end up in jail over, you know, impounding your car. Let's end with this, if you would. What does it take, essentially, to get your car impounded? If I have an outstanding parking ticket for 90 days, are you going to impound my
It takes 4 tickets, and it can be a combination of Ann Arbor tickets and U of M tickets, and they have to total at least $75.
Okay.
So once you get to that 4 ticket and $75 threshold, you can be towed at any time.
Okay. Do you, as best of your ability, send any kind of correspondence to the registry? I don't know how that works. So.
ComPlus, the company we use for the collection of the fees and whatnot, they send in the mail stuff saying that your car could be towed if you don't pay X amount of tickets.
Okay. So you've been warned, and let's face it, most of the time you know if you got a parking ticket, or in this case 4 or 5 parking tickets. So.
And once you get 6 tickets, if you have multiple vehicles, multiple plates, those can be combined, and you can get towed for a combination. Makes
sense. Okay, we'll end with, I said that before, didn't I? Lied to the audience. One more time. Let's end with what is the most common reason, I guess, for a parking citation?
Probably a meter. Okay. Followed by towaway zones, blocked hydrants, blocked driveways, loading zones, that type of thing.
So, if you were to give one piece of advice, obviously it would be, hey, feed your meter, don't park where it says not to park. But is there anything beyond that? I mean, if you were, let's say you were a stranger, especially to Ann Arbor, because I think if you live here, you know the ins and outs of parking by now, I would hope. But let's say you're a stranger to Ann Arbor, and you're navigating the streets. What is your one caveat, if you would, to them before they?
I think that if you're new to Ann Arbor, not real familiar with parking, you should park in the parking structures. You're least likely to get towed unless you owe tickets, because we do go in the structures. If you're going to park on the street, you need to read the signs that are in front of your vehicle and behind your vehicle, and you need to understand them. Just because you don't understand them doesn't mean that we can't ticket and tow you.
Gotcha. Pay attention to your surroundings and take note of the signage. Thank you very much for Community Standard Officer Jodi Dyer joining us today.
Thank you.
I appreciate you for being here. Thank you very much.
Sunny but a bit breezy. It's a perfect day for a bike ride. But wait, you forgot something important.
Wearing a helmet is the most important factor to minimize injury and even death if a cyclist is involved in any kind of accident. Although it isn't mandatory, it is highly recommended for every cyclist.
Okay, we thank Jodi for a lot of good information on the parking enforcement. And now we are going to have Jeff Ford, who also works in traffic, along with Stephen Dye, just kind of fill in for her and kind of flesh out the rest of our discussion here in the studio. So we went on the street. We asked some basic questions with regard to traffic, investigation. Let's cut to our first clip and take a look at what these youngsters had to ask us about.
So if you guys were a witness to a crime that you saw on the street, would you call in and report it?
I think I would, just because I feel like it should be reported.
Depending on the crime, yes. I probably would call in most crimes. Petty crimes, probably not.
If I don't, I might get accused.
Okay, that's cute. Tell you what, we'll start with Detective Foster here. He talks about, one of the comments was made that if it was a major crime like a bank robbery, he would probably call it in, if he saw something. But he said, I probably wouldn't mess around with petty crimes and bother, if I see somebody spray painting something or so forth. Can you comment a little bit, maybe with regard to maybe how one small thing might lead to something bigger, or maybe some of the cases that you've had that were a big case, but it started off pretty small, vice versa, something like that?
Right. I mean, the gentleman's response is a typical response because he's thinking it from a layman person's perspective and not a law enforcement perspective. Of course, as a detective, we want all citizens to report various crimes and let the police now make an investigation and determine what is petty and what is not. But from a civilian's perspective, I can see where he's coming from. He's like, why should I bother the police? Because he might think there's a burden on the police for something, someone jaywalking or someone double parking.
Right.
He may think that's not enough to, a high enough crime to call the police from a layman's perspective. But almost like we had the parking enforcement, I don't know, but double parking, it might be disturbing somebody.
Yeah, right.
So you still
Good
might
point.
need to call with that. So I will always say call the police. I get that a lot. People say, when should I call the police? If you don't think it's a 911 emergency, we still have a non-emergency number, so people don't think here they're bothering the police. No,
Right.
we'll call, make that call, even if it's for the non-emergency number, and then let the police then determine whether or not they want to dispatch a car or take a report. They can go from there.
That's a good point. I work in the community engagement office, and the talks that we have with folks with regard to the use of 911, what I find most of the time is that people feel that it really has to be an emergency, a tornado or a fire or something like that, or they have to see a crime that's actually occurring before they can call 911. And right or wrong, I'm probably going to get a lot of dispatchers angry with me about this, but what I tell them is, if you're seeing something across the street, if you're seeing something in your neighborhood that just does not sit right with you, and you say say to yourself, something's not right about this situation, that's the time you really need to call 911 and say, hey, look, there's a couple people out here in a car I've never seen before, something doesn't fit, can you just have a car stop by? And any officer would be happy to stop by. So I think Jack makes a good point with that while I appreciate, like Jack said, while I appreciate people not wanting to bother the police with regard to what they think is petty, a lot of times petty can lead to something a lot more than that. So, okay, let's cut to another clip if we can. See what this one's about.
What do you think a detective does versus a police officer?
Do his job. He does his job.
Pretend you are a victim of a crime. What would be the most important thing to you if your case was assigned to a detective, and why?
That the detective kept me updated on all aspects of the case. Let me know what's going on.
What might frustrate you?
No communication would frustrate me. Just keep me in the loop of where we're at with the case.
What traits do you think would make a good detective?
Honesty and good intentions, because you can't find the truth if you're biased or blinded.
Thoroughness. My impression is, from everything I've read in the paper, is that what happens is if they miss something very, very small, a criminal can get off, and that's the last thing we want. So I think attention to detail, making sure that everything is done by the book, that's what I would recommend.
Do you know what a polygraph test is and how it works?
Yeah, it's a lie detector test. I think they measure your pulse and they get a baseline for your heart rate and stuff like that. And then if you lie, it goes up.
Can you beat a polygraph? That depends on who you ask. Some people say yes, some people say no. I've seen different studies that say yes. I've seen studies that say no. So it really depends.
Okay. The traffic officers over here are going, gosh, can't we answer any of these questions? Does it all have to be about Jack? But we'll get you guys in a minute. So, Detective Foster, one of the gentleman there at the first says, when they asked him what you do, he said, you do your job. Very succinct, very to the point. I like that. Maybe you could, because, as you know, most people's view of what a detective does is based on TV, right? So can you just give us maybe a little snapshot with regard to what you do and how it differs maybe from patrol? You know what I mean? What a patrol officer does versus a detective.
A patrol officer's primary function is to take in a criminal sense, is to take the initial police report and gather initial information, names, date, time, places, the genre of crime, home invasion, robbery, etc. Now, there's other information that initial road patrol officer can do, they can obtain that. But if not, then basically their job is to take the initial for a crime complaint, criminal complaint. Of course, it's road patrol functions, traffic, things, etc. that they'll do as well. The detective's primary function is to do all the follow-up investigatory work. So that means any evidence that needs to be collected, or collected from the scene, whether from a road patrol officer or evidence technicians, or even the detective has to be called out to collect evidence, submit the evidence to the criminal crime lab, or even process the evidence in our own internal crime lab. The detective will do that. Do any follow-up with any witnesses, of course, to follow up and chase down the suspect. If the suspect either on the scene was arrested, then the detective will re-interview that person, or if the suspect fled the scene, then it's the detective's job to try to apprehend that suspect. Also, the detective is responsible to liaison with the court system, which is huge. There's a lot of paperwork that goes when you submit a report to the prosecuting attorney's office or a city attorney's office. So that detective now has to follow that report through the court system and subpoena all witnesses, make sure all evidence is collected according to the law and the rules of evidence, how it's introduced, and make sure that all the evidence is turned over to the court in proper court proceedings.
So you really take over everything after the initial report, like you said, by the road officer, and ensure that it's handled through the prosecutor.
Right.
There's a lot going on.
Right.
Maybe you can clear something up for our audience. I mean, when I worked the road, and I'm sure you probably still get it too, and again, I think it's because of the media. There's this huge emphasis on fingerprints and where we can obtain fingerprints
right.
from. We'll leave that in, it's okay. Where we can leave fingerprints from. And, you know, I think CSI has done us a great service. What Dragnet did for us in the 60s, CSI has done for us in the year 2000. But, you know, on CSI, you get, you know, a half of a fingerprint off a blade of grass. You feed it into this thingamajig, and, you know, you have this picture of the person, where they live, the cars they drive, and everything. How, in reality, how does that all work with regard to fingerprints?
Okay. In regard to any other forensic evidence, I think the difference of it, I think the television programs do a good job of depicting how evidence collected and detectives, but it's sensationalized for TV, it's dramatized.
Sure.
And you're right, you don't get a hair strand and now everyone's profile, name, address, social security number just pops up from that single hair. It doesn't work like that. But it's good TV, it's fun to watch, I enjoy it. I mean, I wish it did, was that easy, but it's not. I mean, once you submit this using a fingerprint, that fingerprint has to have some type of elimination print or some print to compare it to. I mean, after 300 million Americans in America, who does that one thumbprint belong to? It could belong to anybody. So now you have to find somebody to match it to. Now, once you do find a match, then yeah, forensically, you can now look at the different rig structures and see if it's a match to that person's left thumb.
And of course, they have to have some sort of criminal record. I mean, it's not like it's not like we were all fingerprinted yet at birth, and that these are all on some sort of, you know, national registry or anything like that.
Right.
And you actually have to do a crime to have the record in there.
Right.
Anyhow, there is a lot of confusion about that, so I hope that helps to some degree. One of the gentlemen there that owns a store downtown, and I spent just enough time in the Detective Bureau to really, really appreciate what these folks do, because it's extremely intensive. Every case is. But maybe you can comment a little bit. You know, primarily he talks about keeping, you know, the victims updated on their cases. And I'm just going to use myself as an example that when you're juggling numerous cases, and they're all different crimes, and you have multiple witnesses and sometimes multiple victims, to be quite frank, you forget to keep, at least I did, I would forget to keep the victim apprised of what was going on, unless it was a very serious crime. And sometimes they would have to call, and then of course I would update them. But maybe you could comment just briefly on that with regard to, you know, why or how people get frustrated with not being updated. And I know that, I don't know how many cases you folks are working on, you know, at a time.
Yeah.
But.
And looking at the clip, I thought that was an excellent response from that person. And one thing I do, and I think most detectives, when somebody's a victim of a crime, they're victimized. So, you know, their feelings is going, and their emotion, they're emotional. They're going to be, you know, if their house got broken, car got broken into, something like that. So definitely they want feedback, you know, from that detective. Today with our social sites and email and texting, things of this nature, it has made it, in my opinion, a lot easier for detectives to update individuals. And I can speak for myself. Email is the way I like to do it, and most people appreciate it because they can get it at work, and they're so appreciative of you to shoot them a quick little email. It's a couple of sentences or a couple of words. I've done this, or fingerprints are at the lab, since we're talking about fingerprints. I'm just waiting for the results. Okay. It may take a couple of weeks, but I'll let you know. They're like, oh, thank you so much. I mean, they just want some type of correspondence instead of weeks and months go past. They don't hear anything from you, just something that you can send them. Here again, and using modern technology, I could say, you know, from email or texting, which is easier for us, easier for them to get it. They just love and appreciate it so much.
Gotcha. I'm gonna jump ship to these guys because they both work in traffic, and I know that means if we have a fatal or serious crash, you obviously are involved in that. So let me just touch on what Jack touched on, and that is updating folks with regard to these cases, if you will, that you guys have worked. How does that typically work? I don't care who goes first, but how does that typically work? Let's say it's a fatal where someone has been killed in a crash. How do you keep people abreast as to what happened? I mean, I'm sure that they would want to know all that. So.
Typically, in my cases, the folks are usually rather interested in it, so they'll actually call me. They'll usually leave me a voicemail or something, and I usually try to do pretty good at contacting them. But at least once a week, you know, I'll let them know, you know, where I'm at. If there's something that I'm waiting to get back, maybe some, you know, lab results or something like that, I will explain to them. I'm like, you know, hey, this has been submitted. You know, it's going to take a couple weeks, so I at least try to give them a timeline as far as, you know, when I'll be getting back on them, how things will kind of flow as well. So just to, you know, as Jack stated, just keep them well informed. You know, they just don't want to be left out of the loop. So,
and I think going back to what Jack was talking about earlier, unfortunately, one of the things I think the media has done, when I say the media, I mean TV shows, detective shows, has done is that what it takes, you know, a police department to get results, especially from the lab back, you know, weeks, sometimes even months, depending. Whereas CSI, it's within a matter of minutes. So maybe, and I know that Jeff, you worked in the Detective Bureau for a while, and again, you also worked at Fatal. So maybe you could just comment to the audience with regard to labs and what we mean when we say things. We're going to send it to the lab. What are we talking about? Whether it's detective work or a fatal crash.
I think what I would expound on here is, like Jack says, the detectives tend to have a very large caseload, so they do have a lot of people that they constantly have to get in contact with. As far as fatal accidents, we don't have that many, so it does make it a lot easier to get back in contact with the people that we need to kind of let them know what's going on. And we work a little bit closer, and it works a little bit faster. Accident investigation is a lot like criminal investigation. There are a lot of things that are left out at a scene. There are car parts. There could be fibers of a person's clothing left on the vehicle itself, bodily fluids, things like that. So as an accident investigator, we're very similar to an evidence tech. We'll go out and basically process that car, get those fluids off the car. If there's blood, we'll go ahead and get that off there, send it out for DNA testing. Fibers that we can show that match the victim's clothing off the vehicles. A lot of this stuff comes into play when we have a hit and run crash, whether it be a fatal accident or a serious accident. So these are kind of some of the things that we find at the accident scene that get sent off to the lab.
But again, we're talking, I think we'd all be in agreement that this isn't going to be done in 24 hours or 48 hours. We're talking weeks, months, you know what I mean, in some cases, to get all these results back, because while Ann Arbor Police Department would be like, you know, the only ones that MSP or Michigan State Police service, we are far from that. So let me touch real briefly on one of the things, again, that was covered in the film, and the young lady said something about, from what she's observed, when police lose cases, it's usually from what the media depicts, in quotations there, it is a lack of thoroughness on the part of the police officer or detective that allowed this person to go free on this crime, because they didn't cross all their T's, dot all their I's. So essentially they were either complacent or in a hurry, and that resulted. Can you just talk a little bit about that, and if you guys want to jump in after?
I can talk from my end. I don't think it's that the detective or the police was in a hurry. A lot of times, again, looking at television, a lot of shows, they think that all the facts and all the evidence, you know, the detectives or the police can gather at that one moment, and sometimes that's just not the case. You just don't have all the elements that can be proven in a crime. So once that report is shipped to the prosecutor's office, if they don't have all the evidence and all the elements to prove that crime, then, you know, a warrant won't be authorized, or once it goes to court, you know, it could be, you know, dismissed, or not enough, can be bound over for trial because not enough evidence. So a lot of times that happens, you know, with cases. If it's just not a lot of evidence there, it's, say if you're in the home invasion where there are no fingerprints, there's nothing. A person left the door unlocked, somebody walked in, stole the TV, no witnesses, no suspect information. Yeah, the police and the detectives are going to do our job to try to ascertain something, but if it's just not enough elements of that crime to prove in a court of law, then sure, using that person in a clip, yeah, that person may, you know, get off.
You bring up an interesting point that just jumped to mind. This is the movie producer Tarantino,
yeah.
New York. Yeah. And he's accusing police officers in the nation here of committing murder. So just as a brief aside, as I'm talking to Detective Foster, sir, you may want to check what indicates murder. That is to say, what are the necessary elements of the crime before you hold us all to the standard of murder? Just as an aside, has nothing to do with the show whatsoever, but I thought I'd throw it out there. Do you guys want to comment on what Jack just said with regard to thoroughness, and again, you know, going back to your situation there with the fatals and so forth? I know that every detail is important, but like Jack said, even if you get every detail available to you, if you don't have witnesses corroborating something or so forth, you can only go so far, and then, like Jack said, you submit what you have to the prosecutor, who ultimately makes that decision. But if he or she says, we aren't going to proceed with that, you know, that's not the officer's thing. But you guys want to comment on that briefly, and then we got to change topics here. But
the only thing I would say on that is it goes to show how important it is for people that witness things to step forward, give the information that they have, and take the extra time out of their day, because that one key piece might be the thing that would solve the case. Whether it be a suspicious person in the neighborhood, like Jack says, where there's a home invasion that really doesn't look like they belong there, something that, you know, creates some kind of curiosity within that person that's out of the norm, they need to go ahead and call us. Same way, you know, we might have 10 people call in as witnesses on an accident, but we don't have that specific person that was following that car or following the other vehicle, so we don't have a good, you know, eyewitness view. It might be somebody that just came up on the accident after it happened.
Yeah. So, and you make a great point in that sometimes people won't call or inform us of something thinking that, well, I'm sure somebody else will call. That's number one. And number two, and I know that you can all testify to this as I can, that when you're talking to a witness, they may not feel at all that it's important that, for instance, the subject that broke into the person's house next door, they heard a really loud muffler before, you know, as they pulled away, and they aren't going to bother telling us that because it's, I mean, what does that have to do with anything? But just comment real briefly, and then we really do have to change. But comment real briefly when you're, with regard to being a witness, withholding something like the example I just gave with a loud muffler as they took off. And I'm not going to tell you that, you know, because it's not that important. You know, I'll just describe the guy coming out of the house. So, Jack, go ahead.
In terms of
yeah, in terms of, you know, how important it is, regardless of what a witness thinks, is important to you to know that they tell or relay every detail that they've observed or heard or smelled or what have you.
Yeah, and I guess to look forward, definitely you want that witness to be as thorough and complete as humanly possible. Don't try to omit something that you might think that's irrelevant.
Right.
You know, everything is relevant. I would say it all. I will say that's also, I find a lot of individuals sometimes who are hesitant to be witnesses say it all because they don't want to make it appear that they are accusing the person of something. And I tell people all the time, you're not accusing the person. If you have just what you're saying, what you just seen, you're just replying what you're seeing. You're not accusing them of anything. Let us, meaning the police and detectives, will decipher through who is a suspect, who's just a person of interest, who's just another. Let us do that, but just, you know, relay all the information you have and don't feel personally, you know, bad if you feel as though you're accusing somebody. And I hear that a lot. I don't accuse anybody.
Right.
Well, you're not. You just tell me what you're seeing. You're not accusing anybody of anything. And it's my job to write it down, all the information, using the loud muffler. That loud muffler might have nothing to do with it.
Right.
There's a person driving us through with a loud muffler,
Right,
but
right.
it caught that person's attention. They told us about it. We investigated. No, the person just had to work the midnight shift, just with a loud muffler going to work.
Right.
And okay, we checked
Good
that
point.
person off on our list and we
Yeah,
moved on.
absolutely.
You know, but that loud muffler might have had something to do with it. And I'm glad that person, you know, will relay that information. So don't ever feel as though you're accusing somebody just for something that you witnessed or seen. It's not.
Good. Okay, let's cut to our next series of interviews on the street, and these were all with regard to traffic-related questions and so forth and so on.
If you were a police officer today, what would be your #1 traffic law that you would enforce?
Speeding.
Definitely, like, especially around where I live, stopping at the stop sign at the end of an exit.
Probably turn signals because they're strongly not used.
Cell phone usage on the roads.
Texting and driving.
Yeah, distracted driving.
Yeah.
Mine is to actually use the turn lane for only turning, because it seems like I live on a busy road, so people, it's got 5 lanes, people will turn out into the turn lane and they'll just drive down it until there's a clear spot for them to cut in. And it's so annoying because I'm trying to turn and there's a bunch of people in the turn lane and I can't turn anywhere. And why do you think police agencies write tickets in the first place for traffic violations and so many?
So I'm gonna say safety, but I also feel like it's an income thing for the city as well.
Definitely.
Do you think it's fair for police officers to set up speed traps? Why or why not?
Well, I don't think so because it's kind of like it's not fair for the drivers because they didn't know about the traps.
I say yes and no because it helps out our community, and there's a lot of people that drink and drive, and the speed traps really enforce that, you know. So at the same time, yeah, but then at the same time, no, because it invades our privacy.
Enforcing traffic laws is definitely important. Just having somebody out there. I can't tell you how many times I've been, you know, cut off.
I think it would be better used doing something else. Specifically, you know, there are large numbers of murdered transgender women who have gone unsolved. And I think that their work should be more towards looking for unsolved, you know, murders and people who are victims of hate crimes.
Just driving in today, we had somebody blow a red light and almost hit 3 people. So, you know, I think just having somebody around and know that, you know, there's a chance you could be seen helps.
Okay, probably, I used to work in the traffic division also. I've been here a few years, but probably the #1 complaint with regard to everything in the city was usually traffic related versus criminal. But having said that, we'll go to Steve here. Gentleman here makes a comment about what is technically called speed traps. So you can address the trap portion of that, Stephen, along with, I'm not sure what his correlation was with the violation of privacy. But what was interesting is he alluded to the fact that it's very important that police officers are out there enforcing traffic laws, and yet he had a real issue. It sounded like he had an issue with being stopped or given a ticket. I'm not sure. I appreciate everybody that volunteered on the street, by the way. So just if you can comment, Stephen, on the speed traps, and maybe with regard to speed, somebody else also commented on speed, how speed ties in with most crashes, that kind of thing, if you'd be willing to look at that.
I guess first and foremost, the definition of what a speed trap actually is. I guess for me, if you tell me what a speed trap is, I think back to the Dukes of Hazzard, where the sign says 35. When they go past it, then they flip the sign to 25. That's what I imagine as a speed trap. For me to sit on the side of the road and do speed enforcement, that's not considered a speed trap. That's just me monitoring the speed to do speed enforcement. I think everything here within the city, at least, is pretty well marked, and if it's not marked, you should probably assume that it's 25, if it's in the downtown area, things of that nature. But speed is definitely, I'd say, out of all the traffic complaints that we get, most of them are speed related. And me personally, I feel that I like to take enforcement as far as traffic violations go, because I think if you get a violation, at least if not on that portion of the roadway, in theory, the next time you get in that car, you're going to think about that. If something necessitates a warning, I definitely give a warning or a lecture or things of that nature. But I think, as I was coming up as a child, if I could get away with something, I was going to get away with it. If I knew that there would be some type of consequences from my parents, then that's going to taper, some of the things that you do. And that's my theory, as far as traffic enforcement is. If you do something, and it doesn't say that you're a bad person, as our magistrate says. It's not saying you're a bad person or necessarily a bad driver, but if you make a mistake, there are consequences that come up. But I want you to be aware of that, because that mistake that you make, okay, yeah, this time you may have just run through the red light, but the next time you might run through the red light and you may hit some kids that were crossing the street or something of that nature. And that's what, as the accident investigator, that's what we're trying to avoid. In all my years of law enforcement, I can't think of a traffic crash I've taken where there hasn't been some type of human error in it. Very rarely do you have where a car has lost a tire or something and gone off on the side of the road. There's usually some type of human error. So, we need to be aware of what we're doing, when we're driving these, 3,000, 4,000 or 5,000 pound vehicles. I feel that you need to be in control of your vehicle, so.
Yeah, that it makes a lot of sense. And like you said, nobody wants to be held. Nobody likes to be stopped and given a ticket because of all the ramifications with it. And yet, if you saw a police officer in your neighborhood wagging his finger at you every day on your way to work because you're going too fast, by the third wagging of the finger, you'd be blowing them off and going about your business. So, statistically, and from what I've seen in the studies, issuing a citation unfortunately does curb behavior, at least for a length of time. So, Jeff, can you talk about, somebody mentioned there, using a turn lane as essentially a travel lane. Can you speak to that? Because I see that a lot too. I'm sure it's not just Ann Arbor, but getting the left turn lane and you're going to use it to go 3-4 blocks wherever.
Basically, a lot of people, what they do is if it's a 5-lane highway, they can't pull out of the 5-lane highway making a left-hand turn. So what they'll do is they'll use that center turn lane to pull into until it's clear, and then they'll go ahead and finish their turn. I don't really see that creating a lot of problems, to be honest with you. However, if it's a situation where people are just blowing down through that lane to get up to the intersection to make a left-hand turn, a lot of people aren't being cautious. You can use that turn lane unless it says that you're required to make an immediate turn into a driveway. So you can do that, but at the same time, there are a lot of people that'll just do the speed limit in that lane, come up into the left-hand turn lane. Somebody else is waiting to get in where the lines are broken off and a crash occurs. So, there's some difference in opinion on that. I think one of the things that I've seen over the years that's been really helpful in traffic enforcement is the state of Michigan's using these billboards, electronic billboards on the side of the freeway, and they'll tell you how many traffic fatalities that we've got going for the year. I think that it's pretty good as far as people being able to see, hey, traffic is a serious business. More people die in traffic accidents than are murdered in the state over the year. And not everything is speed and is caused by speed. Some of it's caused by distracted driving, aggressive driving, following too closely. So it's not all about speed. There's many other elements, like Steve says. A lot of it's just behavior.
We have about 7 minutes left, and I want to do a brief commentary and get to some of these things but you commented on following too closely, so you guys can decide. I don't know who has the most seniority, but just address what police officers call a ticket for failure to stop within assured clear distance, because when I worked the road, at least, that was usually the most frequent ticket I wrote with regard to a crash or an accident. That is somebody following too close. I don't care who does it, but just touch on that briefly.
By state law, you have to be able to bring your vehicle to a stop to avoid crashing into the vehicle in front of you. So even if the vehicle in front of you should stop suddenly for a deer or the car in front of it, you have to be able to bring your vehicle to a safe stop behind that vehicle. So
if I say to you, yeah, but it's raining, and that's the reason why I slid into the rear end of this other vehicle.
You have to take weather into consideration as well. Most folks that live here in Michigan, you drive on the snow, it's going to be slick, there are going to be ice spots, but you have to take that in consideration in bringing your vehicle safely to a stop. So, especially in the winter conditions, you're going to have to give yourself a little bit more room to, whether it be to maneuver around the vehicle or, like I said, just to bring it to a safe stop. But 9 out of 10 traffic crashes where there's a rear end, it's usually the at-fault driver that's going to receive the citation on that one. So.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, we're going to get to comments and questions from our last show. First, I want to make sure that I thank the public, I guess. A number of us were talking the other day, and I have probably been thanked more for being a police officer in the last year than in the last 25 years, actually. And I think that's probably, I would assume that because a lot of people realize that the job we do, it isn't an easy job. I don't say that for accolades for any of us. It's not an easy job. The times are demanding in which we find ourselves as a nation. And I think the majority of people understand that, appreciate what we strive to do day in and day out for the public. So I want to thank all of you for thanking us. It does make a difference. If you get a chance and you're at a restaurant or you see, just take a second and thank the officer for their service. It means an awful lot. It really does. So I want to thank you, the public. One of the questions that was asked on our last show, and I thought it was a very good question, was it was a young man, and he said, why do you guys do what you do? When I say guys, I mean men and women, but why do you do what you do? In light of everything that's going on in the nation, the constant criticism and accusations, why do you do what you do? So I put that question out to the officers that I work with, and these are just some of those responses I get. I do what I do because I believe I have certain characteristics which can help those who are not able to help themselves. Protection, to help people, even when they don't think it or want it. I'm not afraid. I was born to do this. It's a calling, not a job. I do try to hide my work life more now than I used to, but I still love it. There are people in our community who need us, want us, and appreciate what we do. We are responsible for overcoming negativity. It's who we are and what we do. Because it is a noble profession. It has meaning and value. It provides officers with the opportunities to make a difference in people's lives and to bring justice to the predators that people do not want to believe exist. Amen. Someone has to be the difference between what is supposed to happen and what is not supposed to happen. I can still make a difference in spite of tough times. We still need to protect the vulnerable ones in our society. Those are just some of the comments. I appreciate everybody that dared to respond. When it comes to police officers and asking for their comments, it's not always easy, and I get that. But I thank you for that. We're going to close out today's show. I'm going to throw up a couple quotes there from Lieutenant General Hal Moore with regard to honor and valor. And again, I thank the citizens for thanking us, doing our job, and to my fellow colleagues in law enforcement, I ask that you stay safe. Thanks for watching, for the 4 people that are watching. I'm just kidding. And if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate. Give me an email or a phone call. Thank you so much. Enjoy the day.